Okay, it's going to be pretty hard to follow that. I don't have anything particularly scary or particularly technical for you today. I thought I would talk about some concepts, and I thought I would talk about some things that scare me a fair amount. I have a hidden agenda in giving this talk, and it's not very well hidden. You're gonna see what it is as I go along. What I wanted to do is explain to you why the concept of cyberwar is bullshit, but I want to also explain why you are going to wind up having to deal with cyberwar whether you want to or not, unless you are a citizen of a superpower. But we'll get to that. Anyway, so there's a couple of different things that are going on with cyber, whatever you want to call it. And the media and a lot of security professionals wind up conflating these different things into sort of one bucket. I saw a note go across on the Sans News Bites yesterday morning, actually, in which somebody was referring to some ordinary industrial espionage as a cyber attack. Very interesting. But is espionage really an attack, and so forth? And we're going to explore that a little bit. Crime, terror, and warfare are three completely different things. As we've seen in the last 5 years or so, there's a huge difference between a war and terror attacks. And of course, there's another huge difference between criminal activity and terrorism or military activity. And then what I'm going to try to do is define a few of these topics so that you can see the differences between cybercrime versus cyber espionage and so forth. So excuse me if I'm going to be a little bit academic here. It's kind of how I roll. Okay, so what is a cyber criminal trying to do? The agenda of a cyber criminal is purely for profit. This is totally different from any of the other cyber whatevers that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes. As a result of the fact that they're profit-driven, they're inherently going to be diffuse and non-ideological, right? Their ideology, if they have one, is money. Money is a very simple ideology to understand, but like most important ideologies, it's very difficult to eradicate. It'd be very, very hard to stomp out people's love of making a quick buck without doing any work for it. I don't know about you, but I certainly love that idea myself. It's just a question whether or not you want to go there. But the cyber criminal, because they're profit-driven and because there is no kind of central nexus of cybercrime, there's no Lex Luthor of cyberspace at this point, although maybe somebody would like to try to do that, they're going to be impossible to deal with. That's the short form. Right? Because essentially, cybercrime it's a smash and grab, it's a hit and run. All they have to do is come in there, and if you can steal a penny from a million people, you've made a pretty significant amount of money in your day's work. We can't eradicate them, because as long as there are humans who are going to be happy to make a quick buck without doing any work, there's going to be a new cyber criminal coming along. And in fact, as we continue to see that there are plenty of business opportunities for monetizing cybercrime, we're going to have more and more cybercrime as the time goes on. I think that's a pretty safe bet. The other thing that's very interesting about cyber criminals is they're quite creative. Because their profit motive, their motive is purely profit, they are extremely aware of the first mover advantage. The first cyber criminal who comes up with a new way of stealing money from a lot of people is going to make the money. The rest are going to be the also wannabes, right? They're going to be the I don't know about you, but it's been a while since I fell for a Nigerian 404 scam. Anyway, so they're going to rapidly shift around to where the money is. There's a tendency to follow the herd. There's all kinds of fascinating dynamics in cyber criminals. But if you think for a second, the dynamics of being a cyber criminal are completely different from the guys that we're going to talk about next. Okay, so the next guys are the cyber terrorists. Now, there's some interesting questions in my mind as to whether there's actually any real cyber terror going on around there. There's maybe some stuff, but the term cyber terrorist is still thrown around a fair bit in the industry, but usually when you see someone talking about a cyber terror incident, they're talking about something like the government agency that got 5 billion emails and their mail server collapsed, or something ridiculous like that. The picture that we get in our minds when we talk about cyber terror is, some guy whose eyes burn with ideological fervor, clicking on a mouse and a nuclear reactor someplace melts down. That's the picture that people want to sell us. The reality of the cyber terrorist is you know, the annoyed kid who DDoSes somebody who screwed up his tax return or something like that. The agenda of the cyber terrorist, though, is, at least in theory, purely ideological. Now, it's actually, there's some very interesting social questions about the ideological relationship between terrorists and their alleged beliefs, but that's another entire topic we're not going to get into here. But the objective is to do some kind of maximum damage public attack with no restraint. And in fact, the agenda of the terrorist to show no restraint against innocent victims is an increase in the kind of the fear factor of the whole thing. The most successful terrorist is the one who is the most unrestrained in lashing out and doing the most damage as obviously and as publicly as possible. Now, if you think about that, that places the cyber terrorist and the cyber criminal exactly at odds with each other. The cyber criminal wants to clickjack you. The cyber terrorist wants your browser to explode in your face and burn your face off. So the threat, though, for cyber terrorists is similar to the threat for cyber criminals. It's a little bit of a different agenda, but their target is going to be civilian infrastructure. But specifically, if you're going to attempt to do acts of terrorism, you want things that are going to explode. Things that explode or burn are kind of the top of the list, and then it works its way down from there. Things that are toxic is kind of almost as good. But explode, burn, toxic, radiate, yeah, sure. And then you get down to the ATM networks don't work, and then you get down to World of Warcraft is unavailable for a couple of days, and some geek someplace hangs himself, but that's it. Okay, now that's not particularly scary except for that one guy who's got no life. Okay, now, the thing that I find so fascinating is this, what I call the cyber terror paradox. There's huge room for potential growth in cyber terror. Whenever I am with a bunch of security practitioners, we're sitting around drinking beer and getting depressed and talking about computer security. We all do the, you know, geez, if I was a cyber terrorist, man, I'd put a hurting on those guys. And it's fascinating because you can get a bunch of security practitioners to sit around and think for about 15 minutes and they can come up with some really scary scenarios. And they're generally scarily practical, and I've come up with my share of them as well. So here's the question. Why hasn't it happened yet? If a bunch of smart guys at a conference can think of 50 or 60 plausible scenarios for cyber terror, why haven't the terrorists thought of this yet? Or why haven't they effectuated any of these ideas? I don't know. It's a fascinating question. Maybe it's simply that the, quote, real terrorists, end quote, have just not gotten around to recruiting IT professionals. It could just be that simple. It could be that we're looking at a gigantic iceberg, you know, scenario of cyber terror looming down the road, or there's something else, and I don't know what that would be. In fact, if any of you have got any suggestions for why you think this hasn't been happening, I'd love to hear about it. Because, you know, I don't know about you, but if I was a terrorist and I had a couple $100,000 in funding to do awful things, I could cost pretty much any government you wanted to name a couple $1 billion fairly quickly. So, you know, it's interesting, right? Why is this not happening? Now, the second part of the cyber terror paradox is that the most technologically sophisticated countries are the most likely to be the good targets, which is interesting because they're also the ones that are most likely to successfully weather those kinds of attacks, presumably, right? But what's interesting is that the high-tech countries are the ones that are easiest to hurt with low-tech attacks, usually because depending so much on high-tech appears to make you lazy and stupid. At least that's what it looks like to me, right? If you look at the United States intelligence community, which has become over-reliant on satellite intelligence instead of human intelligence, they basically sat there and went, got no idea what's going on in the world because we can't see it on our satellites, right? Being over-reliant on technology allows you to get lazy and stupid and makes you a much better target for low-tech attacks. So actually, this may be the answer to my first question, right? It could be that the reason that there aren't cyber terrorists out there is because the targets that are interesting to attack with cyber terror aren't going to get real excited about it, again, except for the few people who'd panic if World of Warcraft went down. Now, the next one is the cyber spy, and then we'll start talking about cyber war. I've got to set this all up for you first. Now, the agenda of a spy is, again, completely different from a criminal or a terrorist. Terrorists want to be splashy, Criminals want to be profitable. Spies want to be covert. Right? It is only in the movie that you run into spies who go around actually letting people know that they're spies. Real spies, real intelligence officers, usually are completely boring, uninteresting looking people who just collect information and correlate it. The agenda of the spy is to surreptitiously gather secrets from a target. In fact, the agenda of a cyber spy and a cyber terrorist, just like with a cyber criminal, are completely opposed. The cyber criminal opposes the cyber spy's agenda as well, because what a cyber criminal is doing is just muddying the water. The cyber spy wants to get into your company or your government agency, get his feelers into the right places so that he's got perfect intelligence collection capability over your network and all of your information systems, and then sit there and do that with a minimum amount of work. Having to worry about the cyber criminal who causes you to have to update your Windows configuration all the time, that guy is really annoying, because there's a chance that you're going to stumble over the espionage activity, or worse yet, disable the guy's espionage intelligence collecting capability. Wouldn't that really suck if you had spent months and months penetrating some government agency, and then Microsoft pushes out a patch that disables your penetration tools? Whoops, right? You went blind at the wrong time. This would be terrible. So the purpose of a spy is to be surreptitious, and historically, the primary way of doing that is just normal human intelligence subordinate, right? The way to penetrate a network, if you're a cyber spy, is not to launch some kind of funky clickjacking worm or whatever. The way to do it is to own the guy who takes the backup tapes home from the NOC, right? That's the way to do it. And historically, that has been how real espionage has worked in any media involving, any media involving electronics or computing. I could point to the Walker spy family and stuff, Hansen and Aldrich Ames, right? Aldrich Ames did not do, Aldrich Ames was the KGB mole who basically sold all of the counterintelligence activity to the CIA for about $450,000. He mooted billions of dollars worth of work, and the way he did it was by carrying out a couple of floppy disks every so often. Right? This was not high tech. This was just a low-placed idiot who was willing to sell his country out for not a tremendous amount of money, and he did it with floppies. Okay, so the cyber era, the modern era of computing, simplifies some of the aspects of intelligence, right? So now if I was Aldrich Ames, I don't need to make 75 floppies to carry out all of the data. I can carry it all out on one thumb drive. Or I can carry it on my iPod or something like that. Ooh, that's really fascinating. But basically, it really hasn't changed things a whole lot. Okay, now let's talk about cyber warriors. Now I'd like to show you why I think cyber war is bullshit. So the idea of a cyber warrior is that you're prepared for military purposes to attack, degrade, penetrate, whatever, enemy command and control systems as an adjunct to some kind of physical military operations, right? And the reason I say that, I had to spend a lot, believe me, I spent a lot of time crafting that sentence, because it's got to be an adjunct to physical military operations. There's absolutely no point whatsoever for a country to go, it's Monday, let's launch a cyber attack on, I'm going to pick a country, Liechtenstein. Right? The US is going to launch a cyber attack on Liechtenstein, we're going to crush them electronically because it's Monday. That doesn't happen. Right? You only crush Liechtenstein electronically if you're planning on invading them or something like that. We'll get to that in a second. So what's the threat here? Well, there are at least 5 huge paradoxes that make cyber war bullshit. And I'm going to kind of run through them in order. I'm sure there are more. These are 5 that I was able to think of during the course of a couple of years of thinking about this problem. I've spent a lot of time studying military stuff ever since I was in high school. I was fascinated in the doctrines of nuclear war and mutual assured destruction. I've spent a lot of time reading military theorists. That's my only qualifications in this field. So I would think that if somebody is a real military thinker or puts any real thought into this, or deeper thought than I have, they would be able to find other, probably even more severe flaws with the notion of cyber war. But this is just what I was able to come up with, should tell you something. So let's just go through these in some kind of order. So the first one is what I call the disarmament effect. Okay, so Let's imagine that we're the cyber war force for some, well, let's go the other way, because the US wouldn't attack Liechtenstein. Let's pretend Liechtenstein, by the way, for those of you who don't know, Liechtenstein's a country, it's about the size of my pickup truck. It's in Europe. Its primary export is dental prostheses. But it's a really, really nice place. Dental prostheses and chocolate, excuse me, to make false teeth and chocolate. They're decided that they're going to attack the United States. They've got, a cyber war team, which consists of a significant percentage of the population. They've spent a couple $2 billion building this up with the money they made from selling their chocolates, and they're going to take out the United States. Okay? So D-Day comes along, and Microsoft has pushed out a patch that just disabled 20% of our weaponry. Whoops. That's an entirely plausible scenario. Or the other one that would happen is you're there, you're in the bunker. The military commanders are there. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to crash their command and control networks, and then the airborne troops are going to land and take over everything in the middle of the chaos, and everything's good. And some intern pushes out a router upgrade, which just defeated our secret attack against the routers. So we were relying on this weapon, and suddenly the enemy is able to accidentally disarm us. There is no warfighter, there is no military thinker that I've ever run across that has ever existed who would be willing to tolerate a weapon that your enemy can go click and make it disappear. It just won't happen, right? You cannot get the US Marines, for example, to carry a gun that's got a microprocessor in it, because the Marines aren't frickin' stupid. They're lethal. And a lot of people make jokes about them being stupid, but they're not stupid enough to go into battle with a weapon that can be electronically disabled. That's a huge problem with the notion of cyber war, right? If you're building this huge infrastructure in order to launch an attack against your enemy, and Cisco decides that they're going to push out a bug fix, your whole weapons systems could be critically degraded right at the moment when you're about to go to war. Now, if you think about the doctrines of nuclear warfare from mutual assured destruction from the 50s on up through the 80s, one of the biggest concerns was always the availability of your weapons systems, right? Anything that happened in either the US or the Soviet space that could have caused a critical degradation of the ability to launch nuclear weapons at any particular instant would actually trigger a potential first strike. Because if you were sitting there in NORAD and suddenly half of the missile system started to go offline, your first reaction is going to be, wait a second, half the missile systems just went offline. Something took them offline. It's probably enemy action. This is preparatory to a first strike. We better launch what we've got while we've got it. It's a simple logic. And every time, if you read any of the history of the Cold War, that thinking was all pervasive through all of the mutual assured destruction days. Anything that happened that looked like your weapon systems were suddenly being degraded caused a first strike. And if you made sure your enemy knew that, then they would be extremely careful about not doing anything that would possibly degrade your weapon systems. That's why we get these really weird scenarios. Like while the US and the Russians were standing at knife point against each other with hydrogen bombs, you'd get people going, well, we're not going to ever do anything that would ever possibly jeopardize your spy satellites, right? It wasn't until the Cold War collapsed that we saw the Chinese demonstrate anti-satellite capability, and then, 2 months later, the US had to demonstrate anti-satellite capability. And personally, I've been shocked that the Russians haven't done it yet, which, maybe tells me that the Russians were actually even in worse military shape than we thought they were. Anyway, so the point is, anywhere where you can suddenly find yourself unilaterally disarmed by a junior system administrator is bullshit. Okay. There's also the cost factor. Now, the cost factor is simply, I don't know any other way to put it. So in order to take over a network, you have to be able to manage it. There's no difference between taking over a network and being able to remote administer it. So if you're saying that you're going to go in, again, let's say that the mission, we're the cyber war department of the government of Liechtenstein, and our mission is to be able to take out the US government the moment we're told go by the central command, right? Essentially, our mission is to be able to remote manage the US government's computer systems. You can think about that one for a second, okay? Any of you built an ISP or built a small network or even a medium-sized network, now imagine that you're supposed to manage remotely a heterogeneous network the size of the U.S. Department of Defense's networks, which, by the way, are sort of segmented and firewalled and VPN tunneled over each other, all this kind of nonsense, to the point where we have to hire contractors just to figure out what the networks do, never mind actually making them work. These are hugely complicated networks. They're deeply layered. They're mutually opposed in some cases. They're not intercompatible. They're frequently firewalled off from each other. Sometimes they're running different protocols. They're running different operating systems. They're running completely different loadouts of software. And the premise is that somehow we're going to remote manage that from our secure underground bunker in Liechtenstein to the point where we can crash it at a moment's notice. How much would you charge if you were a consultant and you were asked to develop that capability? How much would you charge? Right? Because basically what we're talking about is being able to build, Unicenter the next generation on acid. Something that can remote manage an entire hostile network, and by the way, is going to correctly detect if the enemy has done something to try to, fix the penetrations that you've put in place. I can't even imagine what kind of tools you would need. Now, obviously, you could start thinking about this. If we were going to actually build one of these things, it kind of looks like a massively distributed botnet of Trojan horses and, all this kind of stuff. Right? But we're talking about an insanely difficult technical problem. Now, let's talk about a more practical technical problem. If our mission is to be able to degrade the command and control systems of the United States, wouldn't it be a whole lot better if we had people who worked at contractors and all they have to do is just mess up router configurations at critical moments? Right? That's a whole lot more plausible. Even a whole lot more plausible than that would be simply that you've got, a couple of people who are prepared to just blow up the data center at the right time. If I were in charge of a hostile, where you'd have to be hostile because we're talking acts of war here. I apologize. Very important point I forgot to make. One of the big distinctions between cyberwar and all the other stuff that I was talking about before. Cyberwar, we're talking acts of war. We're talking actions that are militarily significant to the point where your target is going to feel justified in sending the U.S. Marine Corps to ferret you out afterwards. Right? So this is not something you want to undertake lightly. And so if I were chartered to set up the cyber war capability for some government that was potentially going to get hostile to the United States, I would be doing crazy things like trying to figure out how to actually construct network operations centers with explosive packages full of ball bearings in the right places, so when we really needed to shut their knockdown, we would just simply blow it up and kill everybody in it. Because, again, anyone who has studied military history and military thinking will tell you that the most crucial part of a weapons system is the highly trained operator. You can blow up the knock, but if you've got the kinds of guys who know how to build a knock in the first place, they're going to be able to get something back up and running. One of the reasons that the Luftwaffe had such terrible problems towards the end of the Second World War was not the lack of availability of planes. There was some problems with aircraft parts. The problem was that the pilots had all gotten shot down, and it takes a long time to train a good fighter pilot. Unless you've got a lot of sort of okay fighter pilots, and you're willing to do a Darwinian process like the Russians did, where you basically stick guys in airplanes and throw them up there, and you assume that the good ones are going to survive, which is basically what the Red Air Force was at the end of the Second World War. But the Luftwaffe was originally highly trained, highly skilled pilots, and most of them were dead by close to the end of the war, and essentially the Luftwaffe stopped flying combat operations. Okay? So if what you really wanted to do was to destroy the command and control networks of a target, what you would want to do is kill all the network operators and system administrators. This means that you, network managers, are a military target. Okay? So demand hazard pay if you think you're going to start getting into it with a nation state that thinks like I do. All right. The other problem, more serious problem. Okay, so the first two were kind of technical problems. Now we're going to shift into just big picture military theory here, is that packets just don't hold ground. This is obvious. In order for any kind of a military action to have any purpose, you're going to do something involving taking and holding ground or delaying or preventing someone else from taking and holding ground. The entire reason that nations go to war is territorial, right? Or it's conquest. Conquest is just another form of territory. right? And there's different ways you can do this. You can say, well, we're not actually going to worry about taking and holding ground. We're just going to wipe everybody out. Once we've wiped them out, then implicitly we can take and hold the ground. But from a standpoint of any kind of useful operations, it's going to involve taking territory. Now, for cyber war, how does that help? How does a bunch of packets help you take and hold ground? It doesn't, right? In order to meaningfully do cyber war, you have to have real soldiers standing by to exploit the degradation or the force multiplication or whatever it is that you want to call it that you've inflicted upon the enemy. So let me put this in real world terms. Again, we're going to pretend we're Liechtenstein. We're getting ready to do a cyber war against the United States. Okay, so we click go on our attack tool and the US command and control networks completely collapse. There's still 100,000 US Marines to deal with, which is just about the size of the population of Liechtenstein. Okay, that's a big problem. Right? Unless you can actually cause the existing military forces to cease to exist with your packets, there's a big problem. You need to have tactical and strategic superiority in order to do the follow-through. Now, the important point here, I'm being a little facetious, but the important point here is there's absolutely zero reason, zero benefit why the government of Liechtenstein, or pick any small country, would bother to develop a cyber war capability, given that. Because they're not stupid. They're going to understand that, right? They crash the US networks and then they get carpet bombed. Okay. Unless you can take and hold the ground afterwards, there's no point in preparing for war. The only place where you prepare for war, if you can't take and hold ground, is because you're trying to prevent the other guy from taking and holding your ground, in which case you're preparing for a defensive war. Now, let's look at defensive cyber warfare operations. What the hell does a defensive cyber warfare operation look like? It doesn't. If any of you can think of how you might meaningfully do defensive cyber warfare operations, I'd love to know, because I've racked my brains and I can't think of it. I suppose you could have it so that when the bad guys attack you, that your data centers blow up so that what? So that they'll bring in their own network managers and build new data centers, right? I suppose you could delete all of your internet porn before you get conquered. But there's really, joking aside, I suppose you could have all of your intelligence information disappear, right? There are certain things that I guess you could do. But if part of your premise is that you're going to get conquered by a foreign power, having your credit card databases get wiped, or your tax information get wiped, or whatever, it seems fairly insignificant compared to the fact that you've simply lost sovereignty. Right? Again, remember, when we're talking cyber war, we're talking at the level of national sovereignty. We're talking about nation states that are taking each other out. It's a big problem, right? I can't think of how you would want to or prepare to fight a defensive cyber war. That means you could only want to fight an offensive cyber war, and it's only meaningful to fight an offensive cyber warfare if you're the big 900-pound gorilla who's going to win anyway. And that really is the hidden agenda, which is not very hidden in this talk. Pretty much the only country in the world right now that would have any possibly reasonable reason to try to prepare to fight cyber war would be the United States. The targets could be basically anybody who's not the United States. So cyber war only makes sense to the side that's likely to win anyway. Which brings up another question, which is whether it's effective or not, right? If you're already likely to win, who cares? Let's say we're the United States, we're going to attack Liechtenstein. Why would we bother crashing their network? Because frankly, we've got more Marines that we can put on their streets than they have population in general. Actually, you could probably just call them up and say, surrender, okay? And they would go, yeah, okay, fax us a letter of surrender and we'll sign it, right? It'd be over in 10 seconds unless they were idiots. And if they were idiots, it'd take 20 seconds. And by the way, I'm being a little bit joking about some of this. I am not a militarist, right? The reason that I'm doing this talk is because I'm not a militarist. I know I'm talking a lot like a militarist, but I actually am trying to show you why this is not a good idea. But I'm really terrified that there are militarists in the United States who are currently spending a lot of money preparing to fight these kind of useless battles. Okay, next problem with cyber war is what I call the blind Mike Tyson effect. Right? The blind Mike Tyson effect is named after one of my friend's recipes for the ultimate epic fail. The ultimate epic fail is you lock yourself in a room with Mike Tyson, flip the lights out, and say, "I'm going to kick your ass, bitch." Right? you would pretty much turn into wallpaper. They might find pieces of you when he was done with you, but I don't know. Right? The problem is when you're in an enclosed space, and the planet is an enclosed space from a military standpoint, especially when we're talking nuclear weapons and advanced weapon systems. When you're in an enclosed space with a weapon, with an enemy, the worst thing you can do is scare the hell out of them. Right? This was a standard doctrine during the Cold War, that the absolute worst thing that you could do in the Cold War was to shoot down an enemy spy satellite. Why? Because there's only one reason you would shoot down someone's spy satellite, because you're getting ready to attack them and you don't want them to see what's happening. It was taken as a matter of faith that if US or Soviet activity resulted in a shoot down of either one side's spy satellite capabilities, that it was going to trigger an immediate all launch. And frankly, that's really the only right thing to do, right? I mean, so your satellite is over Russia and suddenly it goes black. Well, that's probably because the Russians are rolling back the silo doors and you've got a whole lot of hell coming at you in 45 minutes. So the only thing you can do is hit the button and make sure your stuff gets off before their first strike lands, right? This is all standard mutual assured destruction doctrine. Now, the reason I'm going into all of that, a lot of the proponents of cyberwar that I run across these idiots all the time, and they go, well, what if the Chinese, I apologize if this is a bad example, but this is not my example, and I hear this all the time, okay? I don't think it's likely, but you could, what if the Chinese decided they were going to take Taiwan? And so what they did is that they launched a cyber attack against the American Carrier Task Force group that hangs out in that area to prevent that sort of thing. They launched a cyber attack to blind it. Well, what would happen is that they would have the blind Mike Tyson in their backyard, right? The Chinese are not stupid. The people who say, well, what if the Chinese did this, are stupid. But the Chinese would never be stupid enough to do that, right? Because what happens when you've got an American nuclear-armed carrier task force group and it's blind and it's in your backyard? What do you think happens to you? You get nuked. Or maybe you don't get nuked. Maybe what happens is there's a whole bunch of frantic phone calls going, you better tell us what's happening in like 3 seconds, okay? That's probably what happens. But it's a terrible idea. Blinding a superpower, even temporarily, invites massive retaliation. If you don't believe me, email me after this, and I can point you to some amazing links that stuff has been becoming declassified about some of the big mistakes that happened during the 1980s, during like Able Baker Exercise 83, in which the US and the Soviets almost accidentally launched on each other because of exactly this kind of misunderstandings, right? And during the height of the Cold War, yes, when the US had problems with spy satellites, they would, call the Soviets and go, we just lost a spy satellite. We know it wasn't you. It's okay. And the reason for doing that was because, right, okay, so let's see. If you're the Soviets and you have intelligence operatives inside the U.S., which they were all over us, right? And they hear that one of our spy satellites went dark, the first thing they're going to do is think, I wonder if they're going to think we did it and attack us. Let's get ready. Highly messed up situation, right? But anyway, the issue with the blind Mike Tyson effect is that the only situation where blinding your opponent works is if you're Mike Tyson. Now, if you're in a room with a network manager and you're Mike Tyson, sure, you can turn the lights out before you beat the snot out of the guy. But you know what? You don't really have to turn the lights out of the guy off because you're going to beat the snot out of the guy either way. In fact, if you're Mike Tyson, you're going to leave the lights on because the view is so much more satisfying. That's an issue. Okay, so the who would win anyhow question is really the crucial military question surrounding cyber warfare, which is why it's bullshit. Because cyber warfare is only useful in one of two situations. One is you're going to win anyway, and two is it's some kind of a scorched earth defense, which people don't do that anymore, right? I suppose that there's, hopefully they don't do that anymore. I shouldn't say that, but most of the countries that are looking at scorched earth type scenarios are not high-tech superpowers. But if you're, I suppose if you were the government of Liechtenstein and you thought that the United States was going to run you over, you could have all these logic bombs on all of your networks so that we couldn't get your tax information after we stomped you flat. So the point again is, cyberwar is only valuable to the player that's most likely to win in the first place. I keep coming back to that because that's really what we're talking about, right? It means that the only country in the world that is most likely to use cyber war is the United States. The Russians might. The French, I can't see them doing that, right? They would be too busy arguing about internationalization of the fact that it was done in English. But, I can't see it happening from anybody except for the United States. Now, the good news is, well, I guess this is good news. The good news is that if the United States uses cyber war on anybody, they were going to win anyway. So, what's the difference? Okay, wrapping up here. So, as far as the future of cyber war, and this is a place where I'm going to go way out on a limb here, I just don't think cyber war has a whole lot of a future. In the next couple of decades or so, it's really not going to make a big difference until or unless we get more highly technological, mutually opposed superpowers. And I actually don't see that evolving. Right? I suppose that we could get in a situation where there's a Cold War style standoff between the United States and China in the future, but that's most likely to be an economic standoff because both sides involved in that, at least certainly the Chinese, aren't stupid enough to get into a Cold War type situation because it's bad for business. So my thinking at this time is that it's completely pointless for a superpower to develop cyber war techniques to attack a non-superpower because they're just going to get squished in the first place. And the hidden agenda behind this is that I know for a fact that the United States is spending ridiculous amounts of money right now in covert budgets about developing cyber war type stuff. It's not huge amounts of money, but considering the value or the likely value of cyber war, any dollars spent in this direction is largely ridiculous. But there's a more important point than just the money, okay? And it's a moral issue. And that's really the thing I want to get people to think about and the reason I've been talking about this, other than just that it's fun to make fun of the government. At a certain point, you have to ask, when are you carrying out warfare against civilian infrastructure and civilian targets? I know it's not popular, and nowadays the notion of total war, basically nobody fights a war anymore that's not a total war. Since the Second World War, all wars have been total wars, and well, actually probably since the First World War. All wars are total wars. All the targets are civilian infrastructure if you're talking about cyber war. Most of the military networks are not well managed enough to be remote manageable, okay? So if you're talking about crashing a country's automatic teller network or crashing their phone system or crashing this or crashing that prior to launching some kind of an attack, what you're talking about is non-military targets, and that is actually a war crime. And one of the other reasons I wanted to mention this is because, contrary to global opinion, not all of us Americans think that committing war crimes, as our government has been doing lately, is a good thing or is a good idea. I'm not going to apologize because it wasn't my fault. But I am deeply concerned about the state of the political leadership of the United States and their attitude of responsibility towards this issue, right? So if I were not a US citizen, if I were on the potential receiving end of a US cyber attack, I would be deeply concerned and I would be worried about this. And what I would be doing is trying to encourage my political leaders, wherever possible, to approach this as, by the way, Mr. President, if you guys were to do something to our civilian electronic infrastructure, we would consider that an act of war. Not that it's going to matter, because you're going to lose anyway, but it's best to get that stuff out. Okay, so some broad predictions. Cybercrime is a huge problem. It's going to grow vastly worse. The interesting thing is, as cybercrime becomes a vastly worse problem, we're talking about these kinds of penetrations like the clickjacking and stuff. These are being used for commercial purposes. The commercial imperative, the commercial impetus is going to actually drive faster than the military impetus, right? Again, if we were the cyber warriors and we were preparing to launch attacks against the United States, I would be extremely annoyed by the fact that the guys who are selling malware are 10 years ahead of me in terms of the quality of my weapons, right? Those guys are much more sophisticated. And that's a bad situation to be in if you're trying to actually prepare to carry out military operations in the field. Cyber terror, fascinating. Fascinating, open question. I would love to hear what people think about this one. Why has cyber terror not fulfilled its potential to be absolutely horrible? I have no clue. We'll see. Cyber espionage, it's business as usual. The spies are going to continue doing the right thing. Oh, by the way, I always fantasize about this wonderful dialogue, between the cyber warriors and the cyber spies, right? Okay, so we're down in the command bunker. We're about to launch the attack on the United States or whatever. We've just launched the attack, or the attack is about to go. The generalissimo says fire, right? And they click crash on the crash button. US's networks, command and control networks, all go boom, right? At which point the chief of the espionage service says, okay, well, that's it for us. I'm going to go home. Well, what do you mean? We can't give you any more intelligence because we used that network that you just crashed to carry all of our data back and forth. You just blinded us, you idiot, right? That's a problem. It's a big problem. The cyber spies and the cyber warriors are, by definition, in mutual opposition. In fact, all the characters that are playing in this landscape are in mutual opposition. When you talk to people from the media or you run into people who are kind of throwing all this cyber badness stuff together, it's absolutely critical to get them to understand that you're talking about 4 competing agendas all playing in the same battle space. Absolutely critical to understand that, right? And then cyber warfare is largely vapor. So to summarize it and wrap up here, I think no matter how we slice it, the critical civilian infrastructure is still going to be under attack. It's mostly going to be under attack by, the scattershot, random stuff. We all know this is going to be a problem. It's going to continue to be a problem. But I don't think you need to worry about cyber war a whole lot. And maybe that's some good news. Maybe think about cyber war as just, another one of those dumb research projects that U.S. government agencies like to spend millions and millions of dollars on. If that's the case, hey, let's all try to get some of those cool Department of Cyber Warfare t-shirts that we can wear to the next Hack in the Box. So that's what I had to say. Thank you. I can field questions if you've got them. Yeah.
Hello, I am Roberto Pretoni from zonage.org. I respect your point of view, but somehow I don't agree. And I have several questions. Maybe I can find only a couple of them. I guess that basically the problem it is that you are representing the future wars only at traditional warfare level. I give you an example. You told that in case of cyber terror, it's basically a matter of annoyed kids who are DDoSing targets. And the threat is only by targeting civilian infrastructures, which eventually turns in explosion. Well, it happened that I come from Estonia, and my website and my company, they run on a 100 megabit connection. During the cyber war between Estonia and Russia, my business was totally offline, the country was offline, the economy was crushed, and the people, they were desperate. So if it is not cyber warfare or a cyber attack, how would you call it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, there's some facts here that I can't argue with, but it's interesting. I believe that the current state of what people have been disclosing was that it was not a Soviet sponsorship, and that's something I'm sure we could argue about, and I'd love to do that. My understanding was that it was not Soviet government sponsored, that it was a bunch of individuals who were basically having fun. That brings up the question then of, was it state sponsored?
It's also my opinion. My opinion is that it was not state sponsored, and I was writing about it. But that's the point, actually. The internet allows common people to conduct military operation over the internet with significant results.
So that's where you have to disagree. Okay, whoever it was, the hackers who were doing the DDoS or whatever, these ordinary civilians who were engaging this were not engaging in military operations. They did not have soldiers. They were not capturing ground. They were not capturing territory. They were, however, doing economic damage. And that's the one place where, this does get kind of interesting. Unless you can point to a place where economic damage is going to equate to military advantage, it's not exactly warfare. It's something else. And you could carry out economic warfare from a scorched earth standpoint is really what we're talking about. I don't know the term for that. In fact, I would love to know a good term for that. But you understand what I'm saying. An individual, yes, can drag and drop and can carry out personal desktop, what would we call it? Desktop economic warfare, right? That's what we're talking about.
But that's the beauty of the internet. You don't need to be on the traditional military ground to cause damage.
Yes, but that is not a military problem. Okay,
But
and it's
still
not,
is-
and the reason I'm saying it's very important to understand this. That's not a military problem because it does not admit to a military response.
Well, it's philosophical distinction. I just consider the results of the action, and by the results, the country was offline and the economy was crashed.
Yes, but see, as you say, anybody could have done that, right?
Of course.
And it didn't result in the country losing sovereignty. It didn't result in soldiers with guns marching down the street. It didn't result in a victory or defeat type scenario. That's really what warfare is all about.
Well, another interesting point it is that you said that this, cyber spying is only by stealing backup tapes. Well, I've been arrested a year ago and I was charged for cyber spying, and I can tell you it's not only about stealing backup tapes, but that's another issue.
No, it's
Well, Marines are not stupid to carry along weapons that can be disabled remotely. But unfortunately, one of the most daring future development of the US Army is the FCS, Future Combat System, a new DARPA program. It's a $23 billion program entirely based on deploying a network on the enemy ground. And this is just hackers' stuff. And you can disable your enemy's weapons just by clicking. And in fact, the FCS program has been delayed due to lack of artificial intelligence and due to lack of security.
That's a good point. You've got me there. You've got me there. And in fact, another point you could make is, the Predator drones and these remotely piloted weapons systems are all being done over networks, and they can all be they're all vulnerable to electronic interference with the command and control systems. The only thing I can say about that, and that's something that, if you look back through my various writings for the last decade and a half, I've been saying, we're absolutely insane to be building systems that are so fragile and expecting to be able to field them. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on where we're actually cutting our own throats rather publicly on some of these topics. Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I'm perfectly happy to dialogue
we can
with you.
continue in front of a beer. It's all interesting.
No.
things
Did
for me.
you have
Thanks.
more? Did you have more questions or comments? No, go ahead then. If you have more. Okay. Yeah. Was there another question?
Four distinct objectives when talking about cyber terrorists, criminals, espionage, and warfare. I found it funny that you mentioned Liechtenstein that was recently involved on a scandal involving the German Tax Revenue Service, the German espionage agency, and the cyber criminal for blackmailing the main Liechtenstein bank. How would you describe this mix? Since it's not something really new, it happened also with the US government and the Iran-Contras incident, where there was a strong mix of government espionage, warfare, whatever activities with criminal groups for let's say, laundering the garbage that the US government was doing at that time. So
I think between what you're saying and this gentleman's points, something has occurred to me, which is that there is another form of warfare that is at present really undefined, which is kind of state-sponsored economic warfare, or I don't even know the right words, right? But there is a very interesting phenomenon that has always existed that is kind of at this border between outright warfare and places where you just screw up someone's economy as part of competitiveness or so forth. And that's places where you see these interesting things where the governments are essentially acting in cooperation with shadowland individuals, or sometimes governments are acting as espionage agents or agencies are acting in cooperation with with corporations and so forth. You get people stealing personal information, attempting to drive up costs. I don't have a word for that. Economic warfare, I think, is really what we're basically talking about. But that's a really interesting gray area.
Don't you think that your vision of warfare is too focused on nuclear warfare? Because you mentioned about mutual destruction and smaller countries not being able to bully with the US, but effectively US lost the Vietnam War without any use of nuclear warfare.
Absolutely. No, that's a perfect example. That was an example of a war that was lost purely militarily. I'm not saying that the U.S. is going to win every war that it gets into, which is actually a really good thing, because it's going to discourage further adventurism from the U.S. government. But when we're talking about the scenarios that the cyber war proponents talk about, if you read the stuff that if you read the stuff that Win Schwartau and some of these idiots write, the scenarios that they're promoting are scenarios in which military operations are combined with information operations, and the information operations are militarily significant. And I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Only if you're fighting on your own territory, I would guess. But there's an interest of resources in here. You're talking about as the objective of war being territory. That's disputable. At the end of the story, a lot of wars now have been happening around resources other than territory. And if you're fighting on someone else's territory, and you're subject to information operation or like InfoSec wars and military operations, that could be an issue. Might be not for the US suffering an attack on its own land territory, but overseas, yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. Once you start to move, well, this is one of the things that happens a lot when you start talking about cyber war, is it very quickly, it moves away from kind of the high-end scenario of somebody clicking and crashing somebody's country and then spearheading an invasion. And then you get into these much more nuanced scenarios in which you're dealing with information operations, which at that point, okay, information operations are really another form of espionage, counterintelligence, intelligence operations. Those are things that are serious issues that are not going to go away. Those are actually what I'm deeply concerned about. It's one of the reasons why I've been trying to trash the concept of cyber war, because there's a lot of money that I believe is being spent in the US on let's prepare for cyber war, which is silly, when what we really should be worrying about is other countries' agents working for government contractors and having access to the things that they shouldn't have access to. Critical information infrastructure being outsourced to places where it shouldn't be outsourced to. And all of those are huge vulnerabilities for information operations. They're also huge vulnerabilities for information warfare, or whatever you want to call it, economic warfare. There's this thing that I don't have a word for, but it's places where you simply decide that you're going to cost someone's economy huge amounts of money by interfering with it in a way that's positive to you, but that does not result in a direct military attack or a direct military loss. And I've got the little no more questions flag coming up here.
Just one thought for you. And you mentioned the Chinese attack to Formosa, the possibility of blinding US defense, right? The main question right now is that if the Chinese move, the US would be able to answer to that. What happens if the Chinese had the first move and the situation repeats somewhere like what happened in Georgia? Do you think that people from Wyoming would be able to, or be willing to send their sons to be like slaughtered for Formosa? That's a good question, I guess.
That's a very interesting question.
Before we move on to that answer, just as a reminder, in the interest of time, that will be the last question for this round, yeah? Sorry.
Okay. That is a fascinating question, and based on what I without being privy to the necessary information, my guess is that the military leaders of the superpowers, with the exception of Donald Rumsfeld, are not stupid enough that they would think that an information warfare advantage would give them enough of a critical military advantage. Guns and bayonets still carry the day. Tanks in the field are still really what it's all about. And wars are fought only over territory, and packets can't hold the ground. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ranum. Obviously, a keynote presentation that brings about a lot of interesting discussion, which I'm sure he'll like to follow up with you outside over tea, over coffee break. We're now going to have a half-hour coffee break. What we're going to do during this time as well is we're going to split up the room. So you'll find, for those interested in track 1 after the break, it'll be in this room that you're looking at, that you're at. For track 2, it'll be that room behind you. It'll be split into 2 rooms. So just to let you know, track 1's in this room, and track 2's in that room. We'll see you shortly after the break. And again, because we're ending at 7:30 this evening, we will need to maintain the schedule quite strictly. So